The man pulled into the parking lot, and Cameron was already laughing before the engine cut out. A beat-up old car, paint peeling in broad patches, hood speckled with rust spots that caught the morning light like open wounds. It looked like something dragged from a salvage yard on a dare. The man stepped out late 30s, work boots, jeans with a worn-out knee, and lifted a 6-year-old boy down from the passenger seat, a boy clutching a thick picture book full of vintage cars. Cameron had said what he said loud enough for the whole showroom to hear. But 20 minutes later, the most powerful woman in the global luxury car collecting world was standing in that same parking lot, in front of that same battered old car, and she asked only one question. She asked it quietly, almost to herself. She asked, "Who built this?" If you want to know what happened when she got her answer, stay right here, because what followed will change the way you look at every quiet, ordinary person you have ever underestimated. Mason Hale was up at 6 that Saturday morning, same as every other morning. His garage was small, one bay, one overhead light, a radio older than most of the tools on his pegboard, and it smelled the way garages are supposed to smell: oil and metal, and something faintly like purpose. He was lying on his back under a neighbor's Ford pickup when Theo padded in from the house in his socks, the worn picture book already tucked under one arm and a half-eaten piece of toast in his free hand. Theo was 6 years old, and he knew the names of more vintage automobiles than most grown men who worked in dealerships. He had learned them the way children learn anything that lives close to something they love, by osmosis, by repetition, by sitting next to his father in a small garage for as long as he could remember and listening. Mason slid out from under the truck, sat up, and looked at his son. Theo's hair was going in 4 directions at once. He had toast crumbs on his chin. He was already pointing at a page in his book, ready to start the morning's first debate about whether the 1963 split-window Corvette was more beautiful than the 1967 Fastback. Mason wiped his hands on a shop rag and said they had the whole day, no jobs, no calls. Theo looked up from the page and said he wanted to go see the nice cars. Mason already knew that was coming. It was what they did on Saturdays when the world left them alone, drove down to whatever showroom was open, stood in the cool, air-conditioned light, and looked at things they had no intention of buying. It was not about wanting. It had never been about wanting. It was about Theo getting to stand in front of something beautiful and recognize it, name it, understand it. Mason thought that was worth a Saturday morning every single time. He pulled a clean shirt from the shelf above his workbench, locked the house behind them, and helped Theo up into the passenger seat. The car was a 1966 Ford Galaxie 500, and it looked every one of its years from the outside. The paint, what remained of it, was a kind of dusty navy blue that had long since given up its gloss. The rear bumper had a small dent near the right corner that Mason had never bothered to pull out. The driver's side mirror had a thin crack running diagonally across its face, sealed with a bead of clear adhesive. The hood seam was slightly darker than the rest of the body, where a patch of primer had been exposed for so long it had developed its own weathering. To anyone passing it on the street, it was simply an old car that had not been taken care of. To Theo, it was the best car in the world, and this had been his settled opinion since he was old enough to form one. Theo patted the dashboard twice before he opened his book, the way he always did, the way you greet an old friend. Mason backed out of the driveway, and they drove toward Hargrove Prestige Motors without hurrying, Theo reading aloud the specifications for a 1957 Mercedes Gullwing, while the early light came slant and gold through the passenger window and lay across the boy's hands in the pages of his book. Mason drove with one wrist on the wheel and the radio playing something low, and he listened to his son recite displacement figures and horsepower ratings and original factory color codes, and he thought, not for the first time, that this was a very good way to spend a Saturday morning. Hargrove Prestige Motors occupied a 2-story glass building on the commercial strip that ran along the western edge of the city, and on a Saturday morning it had the polished, expectant quality of a stage set just before the curtain goes up. The marble floors had been buffed to a mirror shine. A fresh arrangement of white orchids stood on the reception counter. Staff moved quietly between the display vehicles, a dark green Bentley Continental, a black Maserati Gran Turismo, a steel blue Aston Martin DB12 at the center of the main floor like a sculpture installed for the express purpose of making people feel something. And every surface in the building had been brought to a state of readiness, for the VIP group scheduled to arrive that afternoon. Cameron stood near the north-facing windows with a small coffee in one hand and his phone in the other. And when the old Galaxy rolled into the guest parking bay outside, he turned to the colleague nearest him and said what he said. He said it the way people say things they have said 100 times before. Things that have become reflexive, things that feel like wit, but are actually only habit. The habit of measuring a man by what he drives, and finding him wanting before he has had a chance to speak. The comment got its small laugh. Cameron straightened his jacket and waited. Mason came through the glass doors with Theo's hand in his. The boy saw the Aston Martin immediately, his whole face reorganized around it. Mouth slightly open, eyes wide and working. He tugged Mason toward it without asking permission, pulling with that particular urgency that children reserve for things that exceed their expectations. Cameron crossed the floor at a measured pace, performing the approach, assessing as he walked. He took in the boots, the jeans, the faint trace of oil that no amount of hand washing ever quite removes from the skin of someone who works with their hands every day. He said they were welcome to look around, in a tone that did not mean that. When Theo reached out and laid one careful fingertip on the lower edge of the Maserati's door, not scratching, not pressing, just touching, the way a child touches a thing he has only seen in pictures, Cameron said, loudly enough, that the boy should keep his hands to himself. He said that people who were not buying should not be touching. He said it with the specific efficiency of someone who had learned to do maximum damage with minimum words. Theo pulled his hand back. He looked up at his father with the expression children wear when the world has done something they do not yet have the vocabulary for. Mason knelt down to his son's level. He kept his voice even and quiet. He said that it was all right, that looking was enough. That looking was actually its own whole thing. Then he stood up, took Theo's hand again, and walked deeper into the showroom, as if nothing at all had happened. Cameron watched them go. He took out his phone and photographed the Galaxy through the window, where it sat in the parking lot, looking exactly like what it appeared to be. And he sent the photograph to the staff group with a caption and an emoji, and received back the small, validating laughter that these things are designed to produce. Mason stood in front of the Aston Martin DB12 for a long time. Not the way a man stands in front of something he wants, the way a man stands in front of a document he is reading. His eyes moved slowly along the door shut line, along the pressed edge where the front quarter panel met the hood, down to the lower sill where the body met the rocker. His father's eyes, his professional eyes, which he had never fully turned off even when he was trying to live a smaller, quieter life than the one he had trained for. He noticed, without particularly meaning to, that the door shut line on the rear passenger side was out by roughly 0.8 of a millimeter at its trailing edge. It was the kind of error that required specialized instruments to measure and years of experience to detect by sight. He noted it the same way he would note a slightly sharp note in music, not critically, just accurately, the way people with a trained ear cannot help hearing what they hear. What Cameron could not have known, standing in his showroom in his good jacket with his coffee growing cold, was what Mason had been before he became a man who drove an old Galaxy to a Saturday car show and let strangers talk down to him in front of his son. What Cameron did not know, because it was not written on Mason's boots, or his jeans, or the faint old oil in the creases of his knuckles, was that Mason Hale had spent the first decade of his working life as the lead restoration engineer at Pemberton and Vale Automotive Atelier, a private workshop outside London that took on the restoration projects that everyone else refused. Not because the projects were undesirable, but because they were considered impossible. The kind of work that required not just technical precision, but a quality that could not be taught or listed on a resume, the ability to look at a ruined, half-destroyed piece of automotive history and understand, at a cellular level, what it had originally been, and to bring it back to that state by force of knowledge and patience, and a kind of grief-adjacent love for the thing itself. Mason had rebuilt a 1962 Ferrari 250 GTO that had been 50% destroyed in a warehouse fire in 1971, a car that the restoration community had declared a total loss, beyond recovery, a project not worth beginning. Mason had spent 3 years and 7 months on it, working from partial factory records, period photographs, measurements taken from the one surviving sister car, and his own understanding of how Ferrari had worked in that era, the particular grammar of their panel construction, and their paint application, and their leather work. The car had sold at auction in Geneva for $11.4 million. The auction catalog had used the phrase, "miraculous recovery." Mason had used the phrase, "a lot of Saturday mornings." He had left Pemberton and Vale not because his career was finished, but because his wife was. Elena had been diagnosed late, the kind of late that closes off most roads. He had come home to Virginia, and he had been with her for the last 22 months of her life, sitting with her through the slow hours, driving her to appointments, reading to her in the evenings when the fatigue was too heavy for conversation. He had been as present as a person can be for another person, and it had not been enough to keep her, which was the one thing that no amount of skill or patience or love could correct. After she was gone, he had stayed because Theo was 3 years old and needed his father more than the restoration world needed Mason Hale. The workshop in London had written twice. He had not answered either letter. The garage in the back of a rented house in a quiet Virginia neighborhood was enough. The neighbor's pickup, the occasional referral from the local parts shop, the weekend Saturday drives with his son. He had made it be enough, and he had done this deliberately, with the same intentionality he brought to everything, because the alternative to want more, to reach for the work he was actually built for, and to do that alone had seemed, in those first years, like a second loss. He was not prepared to survive. The Range Rover that pulled into the Hargrove parking lot at 10:47 that morning was the color of obsidian and made almost no sound. It parked with the careful precision of a vehicle whose driver was accustomed to parking in places where being noticed arriving was part of the point. Violet Ashenfield stepped out and took the morning air in one measured breath, the way she took in most things completely, without waste. She wore a gray linen blazer over a white shirt, dark trousers, flat shoes that were expensive in the specific way that expensive things are, when they have stopped trying to announce themselves. The only piece of jewelry she wore was a watch on her left wrist, a Patek Philippe from 1962 that had belonged to her grandfather, the man who had founded Ashenfield Automotive Legacy 41 years ago, in a converted warehouse in Connecticut with 3 cars, a set of second-hand tools, and the conviction that the history of the automobile was worth preserving, the same way the history of painting was worth preserving. Carefully, completely, with the understanding that once something is truly gone, it is gone. Her grandfather had told her, when she was 8 years old and already obsessed, that the difference between a collector and a custodian was whether you understood that the car had existed before you and would outlast you, and your job was only to get it safely to the next person who deserved it. Violet had been operating from that principle for 31 years. Amelia, her senior assistant, came around from the passenger side with a tablet already open, already reading the afternoon schedule. Violet nodded once, which meant she had heard, and walked toward the showroom entrance without breaking stride. Xavier, the showroom manager, appeared in the doorway approximately 4 seconds after Violet's car had been visible from the reception desk, a feat of attentiveness that represented considerable effort and was received by Violet as nothing more than baseline professional courtesy. She shook his hand. She declined the offered champagne. She said she was here to look at the DB12 4th Series configuration and that she had 15 minutes. Xavier smiled with the particular intensity of a man trying not to visibly sweat and led her inside. Violet's entry into a room had a quality that was difficult to describe but easy to feel. It was not loudness, she was not a loud person. It was density, perhaps. The sense that the space she occupied was being assessed in real time with instruments too fine to see. Her eyes moved across the showroom floor in a single broad sweep. The vehicles, the staff positions, the lighting angles, the condition of the marble, and then she saw Theo. The boy was crouched in front of the Bentley's rear wheel arch, nose about 6 inches from the spoked alloy, reading in a low, deliberate voice from his picture book, the way children read when they are using the text, as a kind of anchor for something they are observing directly. Violet stopped walking for 1 full second. The sensation she registered was not sentiment exactly. It was more like recognition. She had been that child. She had been the child who showed up in places she technically belonged, because her grandfather had told her she belonged everywhere that cars were, and she had brought her book as proof of her credentials, and she had read the specifications aloud to whichever adult would stand still long enough to listen. She began walking again, and then she saw the galaxy. It was the morning light that did it. The sun had come around to the north-facing windows and was lying full across the parking lot at the particular low angle of a mid-morning Saturday. And in that light, the old navy blue paint of the galaxy caught something it would not have caught at noon or in shade or under the flat white light of a service bay. What it caught was the shape, the underlying shape of the panels, the way each surface curved into the next, with an evenness, a consistency, a continuity that did not belong to a 1966 assembly line and did not belong to any restoration shop that used filler and sanding blocks and an eye for good enough. Violet stood still. Amelia, who had been with her for 6 years, recognized the pause and stopped talking mid-sentence. Violet looked at the car for 11 seconds. Then she walked outside without telling anyone she was going. She stood in front of the galaxy in the parking lot and did not touch it. She looked at the front quarter panel, the hood seam, the door face, the B-pillar, the rear quarter, the trunk lid. She crouched and looked at the rocker panel and the lower door edge. She stood and looked at the windshield surround. Then she said, to no one in particular, in the tone she used when she was thinking out loud, "That is hand-formed. That is all hand-formed." Amelia said her name once, quietly. Violet said nothing. She walked back into the showroom and looked at Xavier and asked him whose car was parked outside in the lot. The Galaxy, navy blue, the old one. Xavier did not know. He looked at Cameron. Cameron, who still had not processed the geometry of what was happening, said it belonged to some guy who had come in with his kid. He used a tone that, in the silence that followed, sounded like what it was. Violet looked at Cameron for 1.5 seconds, with no expression at all, which was somehow worse than any expression she could have worn. Then she asked where the man was. Mason was at the back of the showroom. Theo had fallen asleep against his shoulder sometime in the last 10 minutes. The particular sudden sleep of children who have been excited and are now crashing from it, and Mason was standing with his son's weight against him, holding Theo with one arm, looking at the technical specifications sheet framed beside the Aston Martin. Not the price, the specifications. He was reading the torque curve data with the quiet absorption of a man who finds this genuinely interesting. He heard her footsteps and looked up. She was not the kind of person you looked away from quickly. She said her name and asked if the galaxy outside was his. He said yes. She asked who had restored it. He said he had. There was a pause, not awkward, not empty, but the kind of pause that happens when someone is rapidly